So this leads me to one of the first objections that I wanted to bring to your attention. And this has to deal with the copycat savior, because like you said, is people say, oh, well, all that evidence you just talked about, Jim, it was just copied. They took from pagan here, pagan that, and so Osiris and all that kind of stuff. And you, of course, do a great job elaborating. And this is something that we all, as apologists, have to do to some extent. When the case is being made against Christianity, supposedly these objections are brought against Christianity, saying Jesus is just a copycat. Over time, with all those resources you just said, Jim, they inserted Jesus, or to dignify him or to deify him, they would just take from Caesar, or they take from this god, or whatever the case may be. How should we respond when somebody uses this objection to try to discredit Christianity?
Well, first of all, you have to know what it is they're talking about, but I suspect they may not know what it is they're talking about. So the
Yep.
first good question you can ask is, show me what the one copy that you think
Yep.
is most objectionable. Like what is it that you think has been copied? And they're going to offer something, the double dying and rising Savior. Okay, well, just tell me, what is the mythology that you're pointing to that you think Jesus, the Jesus creators, the mythicists stole? If it's Osiris, like what aspect of the Osiris story is it you think? Now, what you're going to discover is that there are no parallels to Jesus, but there are broad similarities between all descriptions of gods over all generations, including now. So, for example, if you met someone today and they were unaware of any religious worldview, they were unaware of any formulation of Christianity or Buddhism or Hinduism or whatever it may be. They just are out there someplace on the planet where they have no idea what has ever been discussed about God. And you said, well, do you believe there's some higher power? Yes. Well, describe for me what you think that higher power would be like. What you're going to get is a series of descriptions that match the descriptions of the ancients. If there's a God, he probably can work miracles. If there's a God, he probably came into the world in a weird, miraculous way, right? He would be God. If there's a God, he can probably defeat death. If he's a God who loves me, he could probably, if he's a God, he's probably a creator God. He has the power to create. These are generalities that you
Yeah.
see in all descriptions of gods, both in antiquity and presently on planet Earth, by people who are just thinking about God, but have no really understanding of any other prior formulation of God. Okay, well, that's what I'm seeing too.
Yep.
But if you're going to say, for example, Mithras, which is one of the big ones,
Mm-hmm.
Mithras is born of a virgin in a cave. Okay, that sounds like it's similar. And he has 12 disciples. Well, that sounds kind of okay. Well, do you know what the truth about that is? Because the truth is that Mithras, there's not a lot of written information about Mithras except what Christians were writing about Mithras believers in the earliest centuries. It's a mystery religion. Most of what we know about Mithraism is basically from sculptures, from artwork, and from descriptions of people who were watching them.
Mm-hmm.
It does appear that, yes, Mithras emerges from the side of a mountain, leaving a hole. That's very, to me, telling, because it's common to what we see. Oh, Mithras was born of a virgin in a cave. Okay, well, the story is he emerges from the side of a mountain. Now, but that's not born of a virgin in a cave. Okay, that's a big stretch, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah.
There is artwork in which he is depicted surrounded by the 12 signs of the zodiac. That does not mean he had 12 disciples. So
Right.
we stretch these things in order to make similarities. What we do know is that, yes, Mithras, like other ancient claims, appears in the world in a miraculous way, because people who think about God think he's probably going to appear in the world in a miraculous way. Mithras did form disciples, more than likely. Okay, in that story. Well, yeah, because if you're thinking about God, you'd think he's probably going to form followers.
Mm-hmm.
This is very common. The question then is, are any of these things true? Yeah, it turns out that the way we're going to imagine, we are created in the image of God. When we think about God, we're likely to get some things right and a lot of things wrong. The only question is, are any of these formulations true? And the other question is, are any of them based on documented eyewitness accounts in which they claim to have seen these things with their own eyes at a particular time in history, located in a particular region in the world, and they're making claims that can be corroborated in some way? Well, that's what we're looking at. There's none that doesn't exist for Mithras or for Osiris or for anyone. It exists for Jesus, because this is
Right.
not a story that says, once upon a time story. This is a story that starts with an account based on a genealogy of the birth of the Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very different kind of account. But the first thing you got to ask is is, well, what is the mythology that you think there's a similarity with? And then you better know. And so what we did in Person of Interest is, we went back and chronicled all of those major mythologies that people say are similar to Jesus, and we kind of showed that this is not similar to Jesus at all. But they do have 15 common characteristics that anyone who's thinking about God, whether in the past or in the future, typically attributes to God. And isn't it interesting that Jesus is the only deity that meets all of the expectations? So, for example, I've formulated 15 common expectations, but none of the ancient mythologies contain more than about 10. Jesus, though, has all 15 expectations we would hold in antiquity or in the present day for what God might do and who God might be. So, in other words, when C.S. Lewis says that Jesus is not the myth created from the minds of poets and ancient thinkers, he is the myth from the mind of God. He's not using the word myth as to say a fabrication. He's using the word myth to say a narrative about God. And that narrative about God happens to be, so for example, I can make things up, witnesses can make things up, but if there's one who actually saw it, who says the truth, am I to discard the truth telling witness because there might be others who have lied? No, we're going to test all of them. If one passes the test, we're going to camp right there.
Yeah. That's, I mean, and you do a great job in the book too, looking at the other false deities that they try to represent and say that Jesus copied Christianity, when actually over time, a lot of that mythology started to try to insert prophetic meaning or significance that was related to Jesus in the Jewish scriptures, when that was not relevant or even present hundreds of years prior to that.
Well,
So if
yeah,
anything,
this is
yeah,
yeah, and
bring
that's
that
a
up.
really good point.
Yeah,
That's
bring
another
that
really
up.
good point in the sense. Well, first of all, if you look at the similarities between Osiris and Buddha, so if you just look at the broad 15 characteristics that people describe about God,
Right.
and I made a list of all these, you'll find that there's a number. No one's claiming that Buddha is a recreation of Osiris, though. But
Yeah.
why not? Why not? If you're going to take this approach where any common similarity is, you can say, is borrowed, and when these common similarities are simply the things we would attribute to God anyway,
Yeah.
it's like, this is not, to me, impressive. Not only that, you're arguing that Jews, the one group which we know from Scripture, was told repeatedly, you are not to worship the gods of those pagans. And it's in our 10 commandments, right? Like, this is the
Mm-hmm.
biggest offense. Our God is a jealous God, it says. You are not to worship those idols when I am the true God. You think this is the group of all groups that you can cobble together a story from pagan mythology and
Mm.
sell it to first century Jews as the Messiah? I mean, I think if you're going to do this, if you're going to fabricate Jesus, the one thing you're going to be careful to avoid is any similarity
Right.
to pagan mythology, because this is the one thing that early Jews. And so if you're looking at a story written by Jews for Jews in a Jewish environment, I suspect you're stretching it to think they can steal from non-Jews to cobble their story together.
Yeah, I mean, well said. That's really good stuff. All right, so that's the first objection about when people try to argue against the credibility of Christianity by saying it's a copycat religion. The second objection I want to bring to people's attention is, and this is something you talk about in Person of Interest, early Christians eliminated competing accounts of Jesus. So again, this one is addressing these different portrayals of Jesus. And so over time, people made Jesus into this deified character. And a lot of times people would try to land it, as you were saying earlier, in the Constantine era, right? Is that's when at the Council of Nicaea, he becomes deified. We start worshiping him as Christ, but never do we have any resources up to this point of Jesus declaring himself to be God. So how would you respond to somebody who makes this objection? Like the traditional view of Jesus represented in the canonical gospels can't be trusted because there were so many different versions of Jesus in history.
Okay, that's a great. I mean, so. First of all, you would say that if your family came to you and said, Jason is not your dad, you would probably defend the fact that you are. So why would you be surprised that when people start to distort the story of Jesus, that there will be an attempt to defend the truth about Jesus. And we saw this all the time with the non-canonical gospels that came out of North Africa that the earliest Christians would see coming in late, and they would call them out. These are late. They're not true. That's okay to do. Now, here's the objection I hear all the time. You don't have anything early about Jesus. Therefore, this is a creation that comes hundreds of years after
Mm-hmm.
people who would have known Jesus are already
Yep.
dead. So this idea that Jesus is God, for example, what a joke that is, right? This is something that comes out of a church council in the 4th century. This is not something that was an early claim. So here's what I would do: look, like I said, what's the great thing about the impact of Jesus, if you're just studying the impact, is that you can study all the ripples that exist in ancient literature before the Council of Nicaea. Because usually it's the Council of Nicaea where people will point to and say that's where the whole thing
Mm-hmm.
started, under Constantine in Rome, shaping this form of Jesus that he could use to control the world. Okay, so let's take a look at what's being said about Jesus from non-Christian sources. And when I say non-Christian, so I assembled a diagram of these in the book. This is both pagans. When I say pagans, I don't mean bad people. I simply mean non-Christians and Jewish authorities, because there's a lot of Jewish sources also. Now, look, all this is going to tell us is we don't have to trust any of it. It's true. But if nothing else, these non-Christian sources in the 300 years can at least tell us what Christians are saying. Like, what are the claims? Because they're going to refute these claims. They're going to argue against these claims. Jesus is not God. He's from this devil. They're
Mm.
going to refute the claim. Okay, well, the claim has to exist in order for you to refute it. So what's good about reading those ancient voices in the first 300 or 400 years is you can at least see what the early claims are. And then you
Right.
got to argue. This is such a broad conspiracy. It doesn't just involve the 4 gospel authors. It involves anyone in the first 325 years who had access, because when they're writing about it, they're also lying. Okay, this gets to be a bit of a stretch. And so that's why I think it's important for us, number one, this is why early dating is so important.
Yeah.
Because if you're going to argue, even for example, to argue that Jesus is just a cobbled together mythology, well, then you have to argue that there's no real Jesus. And it's easier to lie about Jesus or invent Jesus if you do it after everyone who lived in the 1st century is dead.
Mm.
So if this is a 2nd century story, then it's harder to even do anything with it to know for certain. But if you can date this within the 1st century, and that's what I tried to do in a book called Cold Case Christianity, well, then you're stuck. It's harder to lie about something when people who are there, who saw it, are still alive. And that's why early dating solves a lot of other problems. It doesn't just solve the problem of, well, is this testable? It solves the problem of, is this a mythology? Okay, well, if it's a mythology, that means there could not have really been a real Jesus. But these were written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses and within the lifetime of people who would have known if there was a Jesus. So I think that's what makes it harder to lie if it's early. So I think in the end, and I've traced the story of Jesus. If you're looking for the nature of Jesus as the miraculous miracle worker who was born of a virgin, who died on a cross, who rose from the grave, who ascended into heaven, that version of the Jesus story dates back not just to the Gospels, it dates back to the first readers of the Gospels, to the students of the eyewitnesses like Polycarp and Papias and Ignatius, to the next generation like Irenaeus, to the next generation like Hippolytus, to all of the readers of Paul like Clement and
Mm-hmm.
Linus and all the people who were under Paul's authority. You can trace this heel to toe from teacher to student throughout the centuries. And what you're going to find is, yeah, the story hasn't changed. That version of Jesus we're talking about, which is the one that I found most troublesome. Look, Jesus could be a preaching rabbi, but this whole glorified holy man who actually works miracles, I rejected. But that is the first claims. Those are the earliest. You won't find a simpler version, a redacted version of Jesus anywhere in history in the 300 years leading up to the Council of Nicaea. So you're stuck with that version. You can interpret it, and this is what happens, right? Okay, so how do I? He claimed to be God. He did the things of God. He said he came from the place of God. He used the word "I am." He accepted the worship of humans. How do I infer? What do I infer from that? Well, I get that. There's been arguments about how to infer properly from all of that data. But I'm interested, is the data there? And the data's there. Now,
Yeah.
how humans can separate on how they infer that data. Is he all man? Is he all God? What's the union between God and man? I mean, we can debate the formulations of this, but what are we debating? We're debating based on the data we have from antiquity. So
Yeah.
we're looking at the same data, we're just coming to different inferences. But that's true of humans. I mean, if you're looking at data from science, we're going to debate the data and the inference from the data. This is just the nature of who it is to be human. And we do the same thing with Jesus.